So today we're going to talk. About postcolonialism as a literary theory, and with that, we're dealing with something now that is rather complex as a phenomenon, and we're dealing with something that is much as a condition as well as a series of reading practices that are ascribed to that. And it's been necessary to build up to this point because on its own, postcolonialism would be difficult to understand properly, and let alone to read effectively. And one of the reasons for that is immediately one of the challenges with postcolonialism is simply one of terminology, because the term postcolonialism invites analogies with other sorts of terms that we might think are expressing the very same thing, such as modernism and postmodernism, or structuralism and post-structuralism, or even humanism and post-humanism. There's the prefix post has multiple variances and understandings. In some cases, it suggests that what's prior to it is now been rendered obsolete. In other cases, it's a response to it. And I would say that post-colonialism has something of the character of all of the above. So let me first of all talk about colonialism, because I think that's would be helpful here, because colonialism, I think, by the common understanding, probably originally refers to the use of military and political power in order to gain economic benefits, the benefits of raw material, cheap labor, and so forth. And so we might want to think of, in terms of modern European history, would think of the British East India Company, and also the process of colonization that went along with that. So the colonization of British North America, or French North America, or Spanish North America. So these would be connected with the idea of colonialism. And we might say, okay, those were instances of colonialism in the past, and that has now transpired, and colonialism no longer happened. But I'm not sure that that's entirely correct, and it's certainly the case that those that write and speak on the topic of postcolonialism do not regard colonialism as a relic of the past. They would argue that the use of debt and dependency can effectively do the same. So there's a case to be made, and I think it's at least it's sufficiently reasonable to invite scrutiny that even though today there are not so often explicit colonies and territories such that they become a part of the original nation, nonetheless, through, let's say, Western multinational corporations, we can see there's still an exploitation of countries in terms of their raw material and cheap labor, even if that what I've just termed exploitation seems to have happened voluntarily on behalf of the countries that have invited those multinationals into their country. But you could also see it in terms of, and this is probably more overt, in terms of the Communist Party of China, which is, I would say, buying up raw materials and involving the use of debt and finances to build up a new sort of colonialism. And you could also see in Islam, historically, a supremacist religion that expands through subjugation and enslavement. So I note that in both countries, or both cultural contexts rather, there is no argument against slavery. The slavery as a concept is not, there's no prohibition against it in Islam. Likewise, in China, there's no understanding of human rights, and so we don't note, despite the fact that there's a similar pattern of colonialism, there's no pushback from within the discourse of the countries or cultures themselves against the exploitation of those in their midst. Whereas we do note that in cultures that have been formed by Christendom. So one of the features of the medieval period is the disenfranchisement, or the enfranchisement rather, of the slaves, and the abolition of the slave trade from Western Europe, which happened not only once but twice. So it was got rid of in medieval Europe. It reappeared in the context of the colonial expansion and so forth in the African slave trade, where it was still happening. And then it was once again got rid of in the abolitionist movement of the 18th and 19th century. So colonialism is something that's been taking place for a very long time. If you read Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness, the chief protagonist, Marlowe, suggests that Britain itself, and he's writing from the context of the Thames River, this was also one of the dark areas of the earth, he says, and it had been colonized at one point. And so colonialism as a practice of domination, the subjugation of one people to another, has been a long-standing practice in human history. It's also taken place in non-Western countries. So it's common in South America and, of course, amongst the North American natives as well. But the legitimacy of this has been a concern for political and moral philosophers in the Western tradition, at least since the time of the Crusades and the conquest of the Americas. There's a struggle within political theorists with the ideas of reconciling justice and natural law with this idea of the declaration of sovereignty over territories that aren't part of the European context. And this discourse takes on particular strength in the 19th century, when there's a strong tension between these ideas and the colonial practices. And it's not, I think, accidental that this takes place in the context of the rise of the nation state as well. So early 19th century, we start seeing the places called, not only called nations, but building up things like national armies and so forth, standing armies even. And there's more of a regulation and more of the use of reasoning, the power of reasoning to orchestrate and centralize power, which began throughout the Enlightenment period, but it certainly takes on a centralized form in the 19th century. So it's ironically in the same period when most political philosophers are defending universalism and also equality, think of the French Revolution, there's also on their part those that would defend colonialism and imperialism as being entirely legitimate. Now, when they do so, they tend to do so in terms of a civilizing mission, as the Rudyard Kipling put it in his famous poem, "The White Man's Burden." So there's a temporary period of political dominion, as it were, but it's only a temporary tutelage to allow to bring the uncivilized peoples of the earth to the point where they are able to develop liberal institutions and to govern themselves. Now, this is not the same as what is happening through the Christian missionary movement, which again takes off in the late 18th, early 19th century, the great Baptist missionary movement, which expands the gospel throughout the British Empire and so forth, down into Africa, into Asia, and so forth. These are not there's a concurrence there, but they're not entirely the same and not with the same motives either. So the possibility of doing this is not the same thing as the motivation for doing it. The one speaks of it as a civilizing mission, but that's almost more in terms of trade and benefit to the mother country, whereas the other seems to be a self-sacrificing motive of bringing the gospel to the ends of the earth for the sake of Christ's kingdom, which is not the same as the kingdoms of the earth. So that's the problem with the term of colonialism. Whereas post-colonialism isn't just what comes after colonialism is finished. It's something that emerges post-1960s as a disciplinary field unto itself, and also an interdisciplinary methodology. So it combines, looks at language, sociology, anthropology, and it is expressed probably most strongly in certain thinkers, but we'll see it combined with cultural Marxism on the one hand. So a lot of reference to Gramsci and his notion of cultural hegemony amongst the three main writers that I'll be alluding to here. We will also see it in reference to Michel Foucault, who is and his archaeology of knowledge. We'll also see that it makes strong and repeated references to deconstruction, the writing of Jacques Derrida, and so forth. And of course, also notions of that we will of otherness, rather, that we'll get from the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan and the ethicist Emmanuel Levinas, as well as Derrida, as I mentioned. So all of those things there are adding a complexity to there. So it's colonialism is a political and a military expression, has an economic motive, largely for the advantage of the mother colony. It has a little bit of complexity to it, whereas post-colonialism speaks less of a military and political endeavor, so much as it speaks of an academic movement in the late 1970s, and roughly concurrent with the clash between Iran under the revolutionary Islamic Republic, so-called, and the United States during the presidency of Jimmy Carter. So that's the context for that. And with that, the main writer whom we'll look at here, Edward Sayid, is writing using the methodology and the language and the concepts that he has inherited from the cultural Marxists, post-structuralist writers like Derrida, and the postmodern literary context of cultural relativism and so forth. But with all that, I want to backtrack a bit and ask some questions and try and consider what's going on here, because colonialism is broadly also associated not only with domination, but also with enlightenment. And not only in terms of its historical context, but also in terms of its philosophical understanding. And I think when I just mentioned the white man's burden, and even the notion that we see in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, there's a sense of Europe and the Enlightenment representing light, and those other areas of the globe where the Europeans were going representing a sort of a darkness that needs enlightenment. So those terminologies arise out of that. Now, when we come to try and define the Enlightenment, we're going to note certain features of the Enlightenment and its view of human nature that we've already discussed on the course. Namely that it is characterized by a sort of autonomy, the declaration of autonomy. It's one of certainly the hallmarks of the Enlightenment, is the declaration of human autonomy from control of social structures and so forth. In fact, it sees these two, the self and the society, as two poles, the individual and the state, the self and the society, however you want to present it. And there's a declaration of autonomy from those other things. So it's in the name of freedom from these constraints. Likewise, in the Enlightenment, there's a sort of an anti-clericalism, which is characteristic of the period, an anti-Christian, certainly an anti-institutionalized Christianity there. And we also note, and I think this is important, or at least it will become important as we continue to discuss this, there's a certain idea that the use of reason is there to liberate nature from the prejudices of culture. So culture then, civilization is seen as a sort of a shackle on our natural capacities, and the aims of the Enlightenment are to free our human nature from that. And that's represented in various ways in various discourses, such as last semester when we saw the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. Those who advocated on behalf of the ancients tended to hold up the great writers of the past like Homer and Sophocles and so forth, and would say that there has never been and likely can never be a period of human culture and flourishing such as that of the ancient world. And they would talk about these then as our models for going forward. So those that stood on the ancient side. Those who advocate for the moderns, on the other hand, tended to hold up our man William Shakespeare as the representative of a man who did not follow the rules of classical tragedy, for instance, who did not seem to have followed the rules, but he seemed to be a rule unto himself. And so even Milton, when speaking of Shakespeare in his poem Lycidas, referred to Shakespeare as noble Shakespeare fancies child, warbling his native wood notes wild, suggesting that there was something about Shakespeare that was of a greatness that no prescription could have guided. He was a law unto himself. So he was a sort of a natural genius. And that cult of the natural genius flourishes in the 18th century. And we have people such as the boy Mozart, the childhood prodigy, being held up as examples of these sorts of figures. And in fact, that becomes then the characteristic of Romantic writing, is the cult of the original genius, the poet who is going to liberate his culture from the shackles of an oppressive, rule-bound, prescriptive form of poetics and thinking, for that matter. So the Enlightenment, or rather Romanticism in that light, is there as an extension of the Enlightenment, and the purpose of that is to liberate nature from a rationalistic and oppressive form of culture. This will be important when we see the application of postcolonialism to its more modern representations in terms of ecofeminism and posthumanism, and the idea, and even in the environmental movement in our day, and the idea that nature is something there that we want to free from human the footprints of human civilization for the sake of liberation. Very much the same sort of discourse going on there. But with all that said, there is the challenge here of the autonomous rational self, which we've traced for the last two lectures, which was articulated in the 1960s by, again, our man Roland Barthes in his work, The Death of the Author. The idea that for all of our attempts to establish human nature autonomously using reason, we never get to the point of establishing that the being of which we are, and we're always dependent on an other, and ultimately we can't ever establish a sense of human personhood with any legitimacy or permanency. It's just a sort of an idol. And so he breaks that idol, and I suggested that it's almost in a continuum with the Death of God movement, there's a century later, sort of a death of man with that, and with that a full-blown crisis of human nature, following this centuries-long progress of attacking, whether implicitly or explicitly, the Christian concept of human personhood, and replacing it with this idea of autonomy. So it's being liberated. Now, I want to speak about this briefly because I think this is all too also important for a critique, not just an engagement with postmodern literary theory, but a critique of it as well, and an observation of its limitations. For all of its claim to be escaping the problems of the Enlightenment, to my mind, it simply perpetuates the terminology of the Enlightenment, this duality between self and other, between master and slave, which allow for no permanency, no historical identity. There's no sense of a formal human personhood that is not contingent in some way. So in other words, the sanctity of human personhood has repeatedly been not only undermined by the Enlightenment and its thinking, all attempts to correct that from within point back to the same crisis of self-legitimization. So that, which I traced in my doctoral thesis and our book, Romanticism, Hermeneutics, and the Crisis of the Human Sciences. So the problem for the human sciences, just to repeat what I said in my own book there, is that they have tried to define human nature autonomously, and the problem is that the subject defining the object is one and the same. And so it's like them leaping over their own shadow, trying to leap over your own shadow. The shadow moves as you move. And there's a problem of objectivity, all of those things. I think all of those problems, which I identified there, are repeated even in post-colonial discourses. So establishing the legitimacy and sanctity of the other, that is the colonial, by using the terms of the Enlightenment, is doomed to fail. So what would an alternative to that be? Well, as Oliver O'Donovan argues in this wonderful little tome, and he's just simply repeating what many have said, and the tome's Begotten or Made, a person is a theological category, which was discovered by the Church Fathers in the patristic period, as opposed to the classical world's conception of human nature, which tended to be described in terms like a soul or an intellect to describe human beings. So if you think about Aristotle, he would talk about having a rational nature, and the Enlightenment likewise, that mankind is a rational animal or a political animal, both of them deriving from Aristotle. The problem with both of those is that these are don't have any sort of sanctity to them. It does describe a characteristic of it, and a qualitative one that distinguishes mankind from the animals. So we have a soul. Animals don't have souls. We have an intellect and a reasoning capacity, which the other animals don't have. We have the capacity for speech, and the animals don't have those. But that's not sufficient to hold on to the sanctity of the human being, which the patristic period seems to recognize that the Bible asserts about human nature. And that is that we have a fixed identity, unchanging, which is subject to God. And so they use the term person, which is taken from the theater. And in the Greek theater, actors wore masks. So a persona is a mask, and a mask with only one expression on it. And with that, we act. It's a fixed identity that constitutes the sameness between the characters, even for all of the change in a character. So take Oedipus, the king, for all of the decline of Oedipus from how we meet him at the beginning of the play, namely a triumphant, prophetic savior of his city, to a man who leaves the stage blinded, disgraced, cast out, he nonetheless wears the same mask. So there's a continuity of him between for all of his actions, this one appearance and the other, and that means that there's an identity that underlies his history and all of our names. Now that is being used of all people, so it gives us a historical reality which validates human life and human experience. And remember, the Christian faith is a historic faith. It validates the importance of history. It's not just a philosophical argument, a series of statements about the nature of ultimate reality. It also validates the importance of human living, and that in large part because of historical revelation, but chiefly because of the incarnation. God himself was born into this world, lived, breathed, died, and was raised. But that time shows that human life is not something to be dismissed in favor of an ultimate reality. It partakes of it because God himself partook of human nature and we consider that life meaningful and important, or he did, therefore we ought to as well. So our lives are meaningful and so forth. And when we speak of bearing the imago Dei, that means that we have persons, we have a fixed, stable identity, which is meaningful, not only to God, but also to ourselves. And we will, because it's important to God, however, we will also hold on to the importance of every individual human life. Now, to me, this is precisely what validates a better approach to the issues that the post-colonial studies seek to address. But they don't do this in general. And so with all of that said, and the reason they don't is because the Enlightenment historicism suggests that history is actually insignificant. Enlightenment historicism is relativistic. There's what we call historicism, but historicism is meaningful in the light of the present. It's not that the past was the ideal to which we are to be conformed, or there's a moral reality that we call the Tao, to which we acknowledge and we seek to conform ourselves to. Rather, we are on the apex of history, looking backwards on periods that, quite frankly, we can learn nothing from because we've moved on from. There's no identity, and the history doesn't particularly matter. So as Henry Ford says, history's bunk. So it's a stepping stone for progress, and progress means not the identity that we have today, certainly not of the past, but what will be here in the future. So note there's a radical undermining of the importance of human experience in the Enlightenment notion of historicism that undermines ultimately human personhood. And this is one of the things that I think that the post-colonial theorists perceive, but they lack the proper framework to understand. And that's because they operate within the context of something I want to discuss now. And I think this is really important in terms of terminology and also in terms of a framework for thinking. And that is of a passage from Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's Phenomenology des Geistes, so Phenomenology of Spirits. And the original German phrase is Herrschaft und Knechtschaft, which is probably properly translated as lordship and bondage, but it's usually translated in English as the master-slave dialectic. And how does this work? Because this is a very influential concept and essential, I think, for understanding where post-colonial thought comes from. Because Hegel is the most important thinker in the Geisteswissenschaften, so the spiritual sciences or the human sciences, and the development of the modern university in the West. remember I said development here, because the university is a medieval Christian institution. It has a full-blown notion of the humanities long before Hegel steps on the scene. But when he does step on the scene, it has a transformative effect. First of all, beginning in Germany, and then eventually in America, and then eventually it migrates to Britain, where they were skeptical at first and no longer so. But the passage in Hegel's master-slave dialectic describes the development of self-consciousness, how we come to know ourselves. And the way in which this happens is typically for Hegel, as all things, in terms of a move from thesis, the interaction between a thesis and an antithesis, to a synthesis between the two. So it's an encounter between two distinct self-conscious beings, me and another. And between those two self-conscious beings, there's a dialectic, as he calls it. Now, dialectic here isn't to be understood as the Socratic method of reasoning, a dialogue. It's a movement of recognizing the self-consciousness of the other. And note that it has to have a self-consciousness. Now, without that self-consciousness, for Hegel, it has no human nature. And so in contemporary discussions of bioethics, the lack of self-consciousness is for certain people who fall under the influence of Hegel and his understanding of human nature, that if we lack a certain capacity for self-consciousness, that we, to some degree, lack a degree of humanity. And so even by that understanding, an infant who lacks self-awareness is said to not yet be human. And so bioethicists like Peter Singer will argue that in certain conditions, it is humane to actually commit infanticide, according to the fact that they lack a sense of self-consciousness in early years. But at this point, what in Hegel's master-slave dialectic, it's the point in which two separate consciousnesses, two separate self-consciousness, constitute one another by recognizing one another. And when they do this, there's a struggle, and a struggle, as he says it, to the death, in which one is going to master the other. And only at that point, when the mastery has been achieved, he recognizes what he had sought to be impossible, because the person that has been rendered subordinate or made into a slave is not free to offer it back to him, because he requires a self-conscious unit. But by mastering the other, he deprives that person of a voice and other. And out of that arises a higher sort of consciousness. So it's a myth to explain how his idea of self-consciousness sublates into absolute knowledge, life, and science. And it's very important for Hegel. So it's a mysterious passage, and it's actually quite challenging to read, as much of Hegel is. But it's a sort of an internal process, and he presents it externally in the same way Plato in the Republic, when he wants to talk about justice, talks about it at the level of the state, but really what he's talking about is internal mental processes. In both cases, I would say that holds true. So the master-slave dialectic is an internal process actually occurring in one person, but it can be presented as between two. And the result is this antithesis between thesis, or the subject, and the object, is when they are resolved in some way, and a higher moment results from that. So, and I'll quote here: "On approaching the other, it has lost its own self, since it finds itself as another being. Secondly, it has thereby sublated that other, for this primitive consciousness does not regard the other as essentially real, but sees itself in the other. And so when initially confronted with another person, the self cannot be immediately recognized, and then appearing thus immediately on the scene, they are for one another like ordinary objects, independent shapes, individuals submerged in the being of life. And then if one of the two dies, the achievement of self-consciousness fails, and the whole thing is rather arcane and confusing in some ways. But this model of suppressing the other in order, this life and death struggle in which you gain mastery over the other and thereby gain knowledge of yourself, is defeated if you when you finally do that, and yet the awareness of that allows you to gain a higher understanding of where you relate to the other. So the awareness of the mortality of the struggle makes you rise above that. Now, in the French writing of three figures, Levinas, Lacan, Levinas, and Derrida, they're going to speak extensively about this dynamic between self and other. So they're using, again, the terminology of Hegel here. And he will say that the other as a radical counterpart is the self. This is Lacan here. That the other is associated with the symbolic order of things. And he says that the other is in some way superior and prior to the self. And Lacan works with this sort of thing, and even silence in counterpart to language will use this sort of thing. Whereas in Levinas, he is explicitly, it seems to me, engaging with Hegel in saying that in Hegel's philosophy, and probably that of phenomenologists like what's his name? Just drawing a blank. Never mind. I'll skip over it. The Heidegger's Dr. Vater. Anyway, previous philosophy had reduced the other to an object of consciousness, and it did so by not preserving its absolute alterity, is his word, is its absolute otherness, the innate condition of otherness, by which the other radically transcends myself and my the totality of the human network. And so he says, in order to be ethical, we have to acknowledge the existence of the other as a matter of ethics, because the ethical priority of the other equals the priority of ethics over being in real life. So there's an ethical imperative to acknowledge the alterity of the other. Now, this is again dialogue between these two terms, and we need to come to these recognition of the alterity of the other and the integrity of the other. Note that they're concerned about the consequences of Hegelian philosophy. Well, when we come to Mr. Derrida, whom we dealt with a few classes ago, he says that the absolute alterity of the other is compromised because the other person is other than the self and the group. And so the logic of otherness, or alterity, by the way, the word alter comes from the Latin, which just simply means the other. Think of the word alternative, it means and the other. Whereas idem means the self. But so the idem and the alter, the logic of otherness is negative in the realm of human dynamics. And even though Mr. Lacan would like, or Levinas would like to give ethical priority to the other, that doesn't happen because effectively the power dynamic that is observed by writers like Gramsci takes place, and these others who ought to be given ethical priority don't get that. And so this language of otherness is taken up in post-colonial studies to describe a perpetual dominant and subjugated framework. So those who are oppressed and have privilege and power and authority, this language will sound familiar to you, as opposed to those who lack the same. And it's characteristic of cultural hegemony. And the same will be applied if we want to give a feminist look at it. The feminine as the sexual other lacks the same integrity precisely because the other is not possible within a dominant hegemonic discourse, and therefore it's the aim of the post-colonial studies to disrupt that dominance in order to liberate the otherness of the other, whether it's the female or whether it's the native or whether it's the foreigner, all of those things. So these things are significant features of this. And so the master-slave dialectic of Hegel, first of all, which speaks of the engagement of the self-conscious self with another self, and then the idea of alterity, which contemporary French, when I say contemporary, post-World War French philosophers, ethicists, and literary theorists engage with on that same sort of terminology. They're really discussing the problems of human nature, given Hegel's assertion of human nature as self-consciousness. And as I said to you, I have a problem with the assertion, and maybe we ought to reassess the assertion of whether it's legitimate at all. Do we really gain our identity of our own accord, off our own bat, as it were, or is it something that's given to us, revealed to us in Scripture, and has an integrity because of bearing the image of God? And I would say the latter. But now I want to look at three particular writers within this field. And the one that is the most important of the three, I'm going to spend the vast majority of the time on as well, is Edward Sayid. Edward Sayid is an interesting figure. He is born in Palestine, and I call it that for lack of a better term, because he was born there before the creation of the nation state we now call Israel, and his parents left Israel and eventually ended up in the United States because of fears about their identity as Christians being recognized by a Jewish state. So he fled so he's a Palestinian American, born under the mandatory Palestine of the British Protectorate and so forth. But his father was in the U.S. Army, so he came back to America and was educated in both British and American schools. And part of his own cultural background is speaking in as an Arab Christian, writing, however, from the American context. So he was worked, by the way, in Columbia University for many decades, writing though about the to some degree about the Palestinian Israeli conflict in the Middle East, and about the conflict between the United States and I don't want to say the Arab world, because Iran is not part of the Arab world. They have their own language. Farsi is not Arabic, and there's a distinctive culture there, and it might be one of the main distinctions between, although I've never heard this actually stated, I'm not sufficiently educated about it, but between the Shiite and the Sunni Muslims is that is one of language within all of that. But Sayid is well known for his, one final thing. I mentioned that he was a professor of literature at Columbia University. Columbia University is the university out of which Herbert Marcuse operated for many decades, and argued that in his Eros and Civilization, that there would come a time, even though there was no material want present in the Western world, there would be sexual wants that would demand to be liberated. And I talked about that already in the context of cultural Marxism as a very odd expansion of the Marxist thesis about the liberation of the working classes. It's now moved to a sexualized dimension under Marcuse. But Marcuse set up shop in Columbia University, and Columbia University is not only a hothouse for cultural Marxism, we will find that it's also a hotbed for post-colonial criticism, and I don't think it's entirely accidental. At any rate, so he's writing from the context of Columbia University, and he applies his cultural criticism. By the way, his own revealed influences are Antonio Gramsci, Michel Foucault, and Theodor Adorno. Two of those three are explicitly identified with the Frankfurt School, Gramsci and Adorno, though Gramsci is more of an influence than a part of it. But he is best known, Edward Sayid, for his book called Orientalism, which is a critique of the cultural representations that are the basis of what he calls Orientalism, which is basically how the Western world perceives the Orient. Now, the terminology, again, is challenging for us, and I want to just take a minute on this. The term Orient is the historical term for the East. It comprises anything that belongs to the Eastern world in relation to Europe. Europe is the Occident. Asia is the Orient, or anything east of Europe is considered the Orient. Let me backtrack a little further. The etymology of the word. The term Orient comes from the Latin oriens, which refers to the east. It's where there's a rising, whereas the Occident is where the sun sets. It's literally to that. So Japan's often called the land of the rising sun because, of course, the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. So the Orient is where the sun comes up. The Occident is where the sun goes down. And there are all sorts of connate words in various languages. So, but in French to this day, the terms Orient and Occident, the more Latinate terms, are still used. In I would say in English, they're less commonly used. We might refer to the Orient or Orientals. I think that's slightly confusing because Orientals tends to be understood as a racial category, and that's a later. It accrues that meaning as time goes by, but it's not there. It's more related to the rising and the setting of the sun. But in Sayid's conception, it is not, strictly speaking, referring to everything east of Europe. He applies it more specifically for his own work to the Middle East. He does admit that there's some application outside, but his primary focus is on the Middle East. And so he'll say the Orient is not only adjacent to Europe, it's also the place of Europe's greatest and richest and oldest colonies. It's the source of its civilizations and languages, its cultural contestant, and one of its deepest and most recurring images of the other. Note this language of the other again. But let me just examine his claim here, because it seems to me in some ways entirely accurate. He says that it is the place of Europe's greatest and richest and oldest colonies. Well, if we consider Rome as Europe, or Greece as Europe, but particularly Rome, then I guess we could see the Middle East as a place of colonization, since the Roman Empire expands first to the east, the known world, to consume Assyria and Persia and Israel and other countries, basically everything to the east. Then in that sense, it's a colony. He says it's the source of its civilizations and languages. Well, that's true if we want to consider Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, as a place of the Greek language. But because remember, Greece is not a part of the Orient, it's part of Europe. So it's when he says it's the source of its civilizations and languages, he's probably thinking more Hebrew than anything else. and because certainly he can't be referring to anything else there. I don't think Arabic is the source of Western civilization or Western language. In the sense that Hebrew has a profound effect because of Christianity on Europe, it is the source of its civilization and language. Its cultural contestant, that seems to me to be valid in the light of the famous battle which is told in the Greek historian Herodotus. And he describes the battle between the Greek forces and those of the Persians. So famously, at the famous Battle of Thermopylae, with thinking about the 300 and Leonidas, the king of the Spartans, holding the line against the Persians and dying heroically there. So this is the site of its cultural contest. We can go and see other representations of this well. If you look at Virgil's Aeneid, you can see the contest lies between the legacies of the Trojan War, a rather different one, not the Greeks, but the Trojans defeated by the Greeks, then move down and eventually end up in Rome. So they begin with defeated Trojans and end up founding Rome. But on the other hand, the Romans are in conflict with the Carthaginians. And the Carthaginians are part of the Orient because they're part of Asia Minor, the Middle East, if you will. So it's cultural contestant in that sense. And then, of course, that carries on through the cultural contest between Christianity and Islam, moving into the medieval period. And it's his final assertion that is the most troubling one, although I wanted to say one more thing. There is a moment of disjuncture here. And I think it's just a side note, but I think it's really interesting. In Acts 16, as the missionary movement of the early church begins with the Apostle Paul, we read Acts 16, verse 6 and 7, and they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come up to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, which is further east, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. And so passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. Down means downriver and back towards the coastline of Asia Minor. So the thesis that Christianity and the Holy Spirit is working on conquering the other is sort of contradicted here, at any rate, by the movement of the Spirit to go west first. And then that's confirmed by the Apostle Paul receiving a vision from a man of Macedonia telling him to come to Greece, which he then does. But back to Sayid's description, it's one of the deepest and most recurring images of the other. Now, this is where it gets more challenging, it seems to me, his case. Because now he's speaking not in the language of an inheritance. So it's the place of Europe's greatest and richest and oldest colonies, like let's say Egypt and Asia Minor, Turkey, Persia, so forth. For sure, source of its civilization and language. If we think of Hebrew, yes. Cultural contestant, yes. One of its deepest and most recurring images of the other. Now we move into, from a matter of historical veritude, into the realm of Hegelian dialectic of master-slave and of identity that goes with it. And so there's this transition from things that are similar and I would say analogous, and I just don't think the analogy holds at this point. There's something about this analogy that simply does not hold. And so in Sayid's representation here, Orientalism assumes that the Orient can't represent itself. It can't speak for itself because it dominates it, right, in the master-slave dialectic. And because it's not allowed the subject position, it can't speak for itself in the same way that in the feminist movement, women were said not to be able to speak for themselves, so they needed, in Virginia Woolf's language, a room of their own. Because of that, the Orient needs both political and linguistic representation by the West. And so he is going to critique, and in his work Orientalism, he will give a sort of a potted history of how this exactly is what has happened. So he will trace it in the writers such as the German author Goethe in his Ostwestliche Divan, say that Goethe claims to represent the East in this and give it voice, but he does so in a way that does not allow it to speak for itself. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Likewise, he'll also refer to Sir Walter Scott in his work, The Talisman, in which Saladin, the emperor, in the context of the Crusades, is portrayed in a way that doesn't represent Saladin very effectively and doesn't allow him to speak for himself. I'm going to be critical of both of those views, by the way. I don't think this is fair to either author, but it's part of the case that Sayid is making, is that what Orientalism does is it uses this master-slave dialectic for the self-conscious West to assert its dominance over the mute East. And you can trace this through various images of otherness and so forth. So the Orient, as described there, he says, has little to do with the real Orient, the real Middle East. As it's represented in written text, there is a presence to the reader, reading Goethe, reading Sir Walter Scott, reading Joseph Conrad, by virtue of its exclusion, which replaces an encounter with the real people and individuals there. So it's a claim of cultural oppression, and an ongoing one, which even the literate that are trying to engage with the Orient, as he defines it, is not possible. So it never gets a voice for itself. So I think that's fairly clear and straightforward. Whether his account is correct is another point, but it's clear that in Sayid's understanding, that what he's working with here is not only Hegel's notion of the master-slave dialectic and this idea of alterity or otherness that we find in writers like Lacan and what's his name, Levinas, but we also see him engaging with Foucault here, and again with Gramsci. And by the way, it's actually Gramsci that speaks of cultural hegemony, and for that matter, he's also going to use the term subaltern, which will become important for another of the post-colonial theorists, Spivak. He'll speak of the subaltern. So both of them are deriving terminology from Antonio Gramsci, the cultural Marxist, by all definitions. So there's been some dispute amongst, by the way, the academic establishment now that cultural Marxism is as influential as men like Dr. Jordan Peterson has said it is in recent days. I am with Peterson on this. I think it's explicit and clear in post-colonial studies, which I think are dominant in many enterprises and areas of the social sciences and the humanities now, as is the influence of Foucault. So Foucault, whom we will look at a little bit more when we come to his notion of gender and sex next class, he will see that this institutionalization of power in this, in discourse, and he will see it in terms, though, that we would recognize in Derrida. So he will say that the East operates like a margin for the colonial center of the West, and the Oriental other is a projection of the Western view that constructs it. So it's a false projection. It's an image created by the person or the culture casting the image, but it lacks any substance itself. And hence the portrait of the Congolese by Marlowe. These are effectively not real people. They're just images. There's nothing real. And he says this is characteristic of Western cultural writers. So this idea of the other as a projection of the Western's view of the East without any real engagement is characteristic of Sayid's portrait. Well, let me just look at a few of the charges against some of the authors that make this. And I mentioned in Goethe the Ost-Westliche Divan, which, by the way, is now the name of an orchestra in Palestine, I believe. Daniel Barenboim, and I can't remember the name of the Palestinian director, but there's it represents a dialogue between the two, because his critique of Goethe seems to me to be scandalous and without basis. I think it's entirely unfair to Mr. Goethe, and it's more marked by Marx's understanding of Goethe than an actual fair assessment of what Goethe says, because Goethe, by and large, is in a dialogue and even speaks of his, by the way, Goethe actually learns Persian in order to engage with it. So you can hardly charge Goethe with projecting his own view of the Persians on himself. So he's actually engaging with the literature. He learns the language, which I just think is extraordinary. And he admires a Persian poet by the name of Hafiz, and admires him to such a degree that there's a dialogue between the two, and it takes place in 12 books and largely is dealing with love. And one of the books is called The Book of Love. But his inspiration is so strong that in some of his poems, Goethe calls him the Heiligen Hafiz, or even the Meister, the holy Hafiz, or his master, which is interesting in the light of the master-slave dialectic. Goethe is pronouncing the Persian poet as his master. Such a great poet. So again, this seems to contradict Sayid's thesis, which is that the Germans more or less take over the construction of an identity in the Middle East because of their adherence to a similar narrative of self and other as the French and the English. Because remember, the French and the English have colonies, whereas the German, by and large, do not really have them. And so there's a lack of accuracy in the portrait of that Sayid is trying to make about the West and the East in general, certainly in the case that he's making for Goethe. That's just one of the cases. And I said that he seems to be speaking more about Marx's response to Goethe rather than what Goethe himself says. So I think that's a significant criticism. Likewise, in Sir Walter Scott's depict of Saladin, the Muslim, great Muslim leader, in Scott, I would say that Saladin is presented basically as a hero, and it's almost hero worship. And if you watch the movie Kingdom of Heaven, Saladin the emperor seems far more enlightened and heroic and admirable than do any of the crusaders, because that's the context here, is the attempt to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims who had conquered it, and to lend succor to the Christians that were still lodged in that city. But in the Talisman, as I say, the Sultan Saladin is presented extremely favorably, but you wouldn't know that by Sayid's presentation there. So, and I have read, and I'm no historian of the period, that if anything, Scott's portrait of the Crusaders in the text is more accurate than most of his contemporaries. And you can hardly read it as Sayid does, as a sort of East versus West text, or even and I also don't think it really is seen as a pro-Eastern novel per se. I think it's just a light adventure of the sort that Scott tended to write. But those are my critiques of Sayid, and it gives you sort of a sense of the general context of Sayid's work there. So once again, he is confining his discussion there by and large to the Middle East. So it's called Orientalism, but in his case, I would say it confines itself to that particular area of the world. Because, to be fair, where the sun rises depends on where you're standing. So if you're standing in the Middle East, it goes further east. And so it's seen as the Orient is anywhere east, and again, all the way over to the land of the rising sun. So that's the first theorist, Edward Sayid. I want to look at two more. I'm not going to spend nearly as much time on them. But the second is, her name is Gayatri Spivak. She's an Indian scholar, a literary theorist, and she's a feminist critic. Once again, she is a professor at Columbia University, where, again, Herbert Marcuse established a strong cultural Marxist approach to the humanities in general. And famous first came to my attention as the translator in English of Jacques Derrida's most important work of grammatology, and wrote a famous preface to it as well. She self-describes herself as a practical Marxist feminist deconstructionist, which will give you some sense of where she sees her cultural influences. Again, and it will be much like Sayid, it will be with Foucault and with Gramsci. And she largely speaks of the idea of the subaltern in her theory. And so now, again, she's Indian now, whereas Sayid came from Palestine, but operated initially in Columbia, eventually at Harvard and other institutions as well, but chiefly Columbia. Spivak is likewise at Columbia, but she is now going to talk about Indian literature and Indian understanding. But the term subaltern comes directly from Antonio Gramsci, and it refers to those social groups that have been excluded and displaced from socioeconomic institutions in order to deny them political voices. So the other there. These are what Gramsci calls the subaltern. And this enters into the vocabulary of postcolonialism through groups of historians like Spivak. And she will identify it not just with India then, but also with the colonialist narrative of the British vis-a-vis the Indians, but also the colonialized people throughout the Indian subcontinent. So it's it will be imperial history told from below. It's giving voice to those voices which the cultural oppression of the dominant social political group had denied. So that's Spivak more or less. And the idea here now of subaltern has nothing to do with I guess it does have to do with alterity, but it's a beneath the other in some sense. It's got has some sort of etymological connection there. I won't say much more about Spivak other than to say she's an important part of that discussion. But it certainly depends on a Marxist theory of history. So it's trying to free the peoples of India from the perspective of the proletariat, who are seen as the British now at that point. The final theorist that I want to look at is another Indian scholar, but again, as all three are operating in the United States. His name is Homi Bhabha. So he's an Indian English scholar and critical theorist. Unlike the other two, he largely operated at Harvard University. So note that all three are operating in hegemonic academic institutions. These are leading institutions, highly influential. Bhabha is one of the more important figures in contemporary post-colonial studies. He's now I believe, this Wikipedia page, he is 70. He comes up with variations on Spivak's approach, I would say. So he's describing literature from the perspective of the native, those that have been historically, culturally oppressed. By the way, in terms of his influences, he acknowledges Edward Sayid. But once again, we'll also mention, what are my notes here? Is that Gramsci again? Yeah, I think so. And post-structuralist thinking, Derrida, the usual suspects. So again, using the language and the disruptive narrative practices of Derrida, wedding them to the power motivation and the archaeology of knowledge approach of Foucault, with the master-slave dialectic, which they've inherited from Hegel and has been passed on through the French schools of critical theory and so on. So Homi Bhabha presents cultural difference as an alternative to cultural diversity. And I think this is his most important contribution in some ways. So in cultural diversity, a culture is an object of empirical knowledge, and it pre-exists the knower, whereas cultural difference sees the culture at the point at which the two or more cultures meet and where they actually occur. So it's not just as an object of knowledge, it allows a dialogue of sorts between two things that have their own voices and their own legitimacy. So once again, it's trying to address the challenge to human nature, which is a legacy, to my mind, of Hegel's notion of human nature, and the problem of knowing the other without oppressing the other, which fits into the whole notion of colonialism again, and the question of legitimacy. And all of these not only have material consequences, they also have even larger ones for human nature and the sanctity of human life, which, once again, to repeat what I said at the outset, is in terms of my own critique of all this, it seems to me that we cannot solve the problem of a defective notion of human nature in Hegel by appealing to the very constructs of a duality between self and other that we get from Hegel. We need to appeal to something that has a permanence and recognizes the legitimacy of human life and a continuity there and an integrity that does not change with time per se. So it's not amenable to progress. It's also not subject to regress. There's an integrity there. That is what the Church Fathers bequeath to us in their notion of human personhood. So yes, we have a soul as opposed to our body, but in many ways, more importantly, that soul has a human identity which is connected with a persona, which exists and remains constant irrespective of what we do with that. So it's the image, the imago Dei. Those are the areas in which I would say that contemporary Christian engagements with postcolonialism can be most fruitful. I haven't even touched on how this applies to Native studies. I'm a Canadian, I'm Native myself, but you could see from the basis of this that if you want to see the Europeans as the West, they can also colonize and go east all the way around the East. In fact, when they first land in North America, they think they've encountered India. And so that would be the East. It just happens that they were wrong. They'd gone further west. They hadn't hit the East by going west. They had encountered some, or at least not part of the continent of Asia, an entirely different continent. But the same notions of human nature and alterity and otherness in the master-slave dialectic, all of those things are brought to bear on contemporary native discourses and so forth. And what I said about in my critique of Goethe, of Sayid on Goethe and Scott, which could have been applied further, I would say applies also here in the North American context as well. But that would be another subject and too far afield from where I want to talk today. But I think I have dealt with that sufficiently here. So I'll talk to you next time.